Hi, everyone. This is Courtney St. John, and I'm really excited about sharing my project with you. As a coordinator of assessment for language arts assessments for a large urban school district, I decided to try and do an analysis of district pre- and post-test assessment results. So let's get started with the presentation. As a coordinator of assessment, I have lots of times to go through and put together assessments. It usually takes about 18 months. And while I'm doing that, I'm always constantly thinking about questions that are going on in my head about assessments. Particularly, I think a lot about the relationship between curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So while I'm developing these assessments, these are two of the questions that kind of frequently come up in my head. Like, how can this kind of formative assessment that I'm creating help be a snapshot to help teachers with their instruction with students? And could a pre-test score be used to actually predict a post-test score? I'm not going to really kind of tell you exactly which one of these questions I'm working on just yet in this presentation, but you'll figure it out as we go through. But that's pretty much the problem that I was thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about the review of literature that I have from these. I've done a good bit of studying about formative assessments and how they can help teachers with instructional decisions, kind of taking that snapshot and seeing, are there any mid-course corrections? And here's some of the information I found about formative assessments as they relate to classroom instruction. There's several authors, researchers have come up with these conclusions. And one is, if we really want to learn from assessments, that's a big if we really want to learn from assessments, then our evidence of the learning of the students needs to be really centered around these three instructional processes. So for instance, teachers and students should really be able to establish that desired learning goal. They should be able to establish where they are in their concept of learning, and they really need to know how to get to that desired learning goal. So that's one of the things that I've read through the literature. I know there's a lot to read, but that's one thing so far. Another thing that I've learned through the review of lit is really centering around Black and Willem's study. I think it's a meta-analysis called Inside the Box was their paper. But they really started telling us about how to get to those achievement gains that we want to see with students. So they found statistically significant achievement gains for students if descriptive feedback was given back to them about how they were progressing with their learning. What a concept. They also said that it was really important to go through and have students involved in that process for learning. So you might be thinking about process for learning. What are you talking about, students being involved with the process of assessment? So let's go on to the next slide and talk about that a little bit more. So student involvement in the assessment process, yeah, but it's really kind of centering more around that self-assessment process that kids should be going through with their learning. So when students are involved with that, they find a purpose for their learning, and they also figure out what they should do to be able to be successful in the classroom. So those were three really good, important points that I wanted to share with you from the review of lit. Of course, there was a little bit more talking with or thinking about Champus's ways to provide feedback with students, but I thought this was a good beginning to kind of lay the foundation for the analysis that I did with our assessments. So we've talked a lot about curriculum and instruction and assessment, and really kind of reasons why you would want to have a formative assessment. You eventually want to get those results back to the students. So I guess before we get the results back to students, it might be a good activity to go through and figure out how your pre-test or how your assessments, what kind of information they're communicating, and how do they maybe relate with each other. So I started off with my study, and one of the things I want to share with you is how our formative assessments are constructed. I think that's key. In my school district, we do follow some strict guidelines. These guidelines are provided by APA, which is the American Psychological Association, also NCME, the National Council of Measurement and Education, and finally, the last bit of guidelines that we follow is the AERA, or the American Education Research Association guidelines. Those are the guidelines that help us determine that, yes, it's going to take 18 months to put a test together, all the way from start to finish, beginning with item creation and whatnot. So we in our district have fully implemented those guidelines for the development. Another thing that we also do in our district is to go through and do a yearly invitation to teachers to come out and do a key and item reviews for our assessments. Through these reviews, it helps kind of build buy-in with teachers, but it also helps make sure that our assessments are okay. We look at p-values for items, we look at point by serial, we look at standard alignment, we look at all kinds of stuff. It's a wealth of information that we're teaching teachers about how to kind of use item analysis and statistics to help go through figuring out what kids, how they're answering questions, what they know, where are the misconceptions happening, what can we do to fix those misconceptions. Let's see. So that gives you a little bit of background of our assessments and how we kind of put them together. The administration of this particular analysis, or data where we got to analyze where it came from, that's what I wanted to say, is an administration that took place in January, May of 2015. So that was last school year. This particular administration was provided to students through paper and pencil. Next year we'll have online, but last year it was paper and pencil. All the assessments, all of our formative and summative assessments are presented to students in a one-class period. What does that mean? Well, it means about 50 to 60-minute time period for the students. If they're actively engaged and they need additional time, that's fine, they can get it, but generally we're trying to stick to that one class period. Now, a 4-week window is given to each local school, which is a time period at which the school can go through and have the administration of the assessment. For this one, the local school gets to pick exactly what day all the freshman students were going to take this particular exam. It just has to take place in that 4-week window. So all the high schools probably pick different days, or maybe the same day. But that gives you a little information about our administration process. So we had the administration of the test, and then we kind of got the responses. So let me tell you now a little bit more about my method that kind of led me to the analysis that we had. We capture the student responses by students bubbling in on answered documents. We scan them into a web-based scoring tool that helps score them. We do have, well, both of the administrations were a little bit different. Our pre-test is optional for our schools to participate in, and our post-test is required for them to participate in. The reason why there is an option is because we do want to have schools have the flexibility to have as many teaching days as possible. If I were in the classroom, I would ask my administrators to be able to give that pre-test, because I want to find out what kids already know, what information they come to me with, and then I could build upon that versus just assuming they know nothing, I will teach them everything. Kind of like a curriculum philosophy going on in there. Okay, so we had our pre-test in January. It was optional. We had a post-test in May. It was required. Our May, because it was required, population or participants that participated in the assessment is much larger. It's about 13,000 kids participated in this freshman language arts course assessment, where our January pre-test, we only had almost 5,000 kids participate. So not even half, but that kind of tells you a little bit about, you know, how much data I could actually look at. So instead of all 13,000 participants, I couldn't look at all of them because I didn't have all the pre-test, but I did have about 5,000 scores to start pulling my sample from. So I Now, talking about a little bit about my sample selection, what I did was I went to my pretest information and I did a random number generator for every one of my rows of data. Okay, so what I did was I numbered everything, and then I had the program go through and say, pull me all the 24, 25, 26, 27 students, something very, very random and generic. I got 253 students with that. And I thought that's a good size out of 5,000. And then what I did was I took the student number that they had from the pretest and used it as a lookup in our post-test file, and then started merging my pretest and post-test scores together. So what I really kind of wanted to find out was, could I possibly use a pretest score to predict what a post-test score was? So that's how I kind of pulled my sample and how I put my data together. After I pulled my data, then I kind of wanted to see what kind of demographic information I had of my sample and was it close to my population. Of course, I looked at gender, and quite surprisingly, in my sample, like for instance, I had 52% of males in my sample, but out of the whole general population, I had 51% males. So I thought, oh, this could be a pretty good sample. I looked at ethnicity. Some of my ethnicity values were, maybe 1% off from my sample to my population. For instance, my Hispanic sample population was 26%. 26% Hispanic, but the general population was 25% Hispanic. My African American population was 37% in my sample, but as a population as whole is 34%. So you can see how some of the things were similar, but maybe 1 or 2 off. So I had a really good feeling that, hey, this sample is pretty good. I did look at free and reduced lunch rate, giftedness, special programs, which also included special ed, English language learners, those kind of percentages. But when I went through and again looked at my percentages for my sample compared to the total population, I felt like it was really pretty close. So that was great. The one thing I did want to talk about is grade levels, because you might be saying, okay, freshmen, 9th grade. Well, not really. In our district, we have 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, 12th graders, all taking that freshman language arts course. Generally, the majority of the kids taking the course, 95% of the total population, is in 9th grade. But our 10th and 11th and 12th graders are students that have been struggling with that course and having to retake it. Our 8th graders are a little bit different. We have a couple of schools, 4 middle schools, that are trying to catch kids up and get them to their graduating cohort. So that particular group of 8th graders takes a combination in one calendar school year of the whole 8th grade language arts course and the freshman language arts course together. It's a very rigorous, but our schools have gotten some really good results with that. So anyway, that tells you a little bit about how I collected my sample data to analyze. The next thing I started doing was looking at frequency distribution of the scores between our pretest and post-test. I grouped everything together in bands, and when I did that, something really cool popped out at me. If I was looking at scores from 1 to 34, that's the possibility. There were 34 questions on the assessment, so a raw score from 1 to 34 is what I was looking at. And I started grouping things in bands, 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, so on and so forth. But when I looked at my frequency distribution, I saw that 80% of our students fell within a series of bands, anywhere from 6 to 20 as a raw score. So I thought that was pretty good. It was really chunked in the middle. And then I looked at the post-test frequency distribution band, and I realized that that band had shifted a little bit. So instead of starting at 6 to 10, the new start was 11 to 15. And 85% of the kids were now in that band, and it shifted a little bit. I think that was something that I expected to see. I expected to see some growth of student learning during the second semester of content, and that frequency distribution displayed that little bit of growth. So that was exciting. Of course, you would think that the number of lower scores would be reduced, and it was. And you would also think that the number of high scores would increase from pre-test to post-test, and it did. So that was really kind of neat to do that frequency distribution to look at that. Then we started going through and putting the data into SPSS and started looking at the descriptive statistics that occurred. I don't have like big charts in here to show you, but I just wanted to briefly talk about what I found with the data. The mean for the pretest was 12.79. That was interesting to me because I thought, wow, a third of the students mean, okay, it's right in the middle of our data. They know about, I mean, the middle of our students know about a third of the content, because getting 12 points out of 34 is about a third of the content. So I thought that was pretty interesting to see that on the pretest. The mean that did rise to 17 points on the post, really 17.4. The median of the scores for the pre was 12, while it was 17 for the post. The mode for the pretest was 10, while the mode for the post was 17. Standard deviation changed a little bit between the pre and the post. The pre was 5.29 and the post was 5.15. So I thought those were some really good information that I got out of the descriptive statistics. And then I was able to go through and find out from that standard deviation what one standard deviation above and below the mean would actually be. So I included that into my paper. Skewness and kurtosis is something that I wanted to talk about next, but let me actually show you the graphs. Okay, so here is my frequency polygons that I got out of SPSS for the pre-test and post-test, and they kind of help me explain skewness and kurtosis a little bit. For the pre-test that we have, it is ever so slightly skewed to the positive. It's probably because I had about 11 points that were outliers. 8, I think, as a matter of fact, that were kind of on the heavy side. So that would definitely explain why it was ever so slightly skewed to the positive. The kurtosis is ever so slightly flattened at a negative 0.2. Very minimal flattening, but that's what the pretest data looked like. Now look at the post-test graphic that I am showing you right there. And now this changed a little bit, where my skewness is ever tiny, slightly skewed to the negative. And my kurtosis is about the same as it was for the pretest, negative 0.22. So ever slightly so flattened. That's probably attributing to, again, some outliers, a little bit more on the negative side of my data. So that would explain that skewness and kurtosis. So I like the graphs. I also really like them because they actually kind of almost displayed this near normal distribution. So from that point, thinking about a near normal distribution, I thought, okay, I can continue my analysis. And what I then really wanted to find out is, again, can a pretest score predict a post-test score? To do this, I started doing a correlation and regression and kind of set up my hypothesis. My null hypothesis was that there's no relationship between these two variables, the variables of pretest and post-test scores. And if that was going to be the case, my p-value would be greater than my alpha, and my alpha at this point was 0.50. Also showing that if I got it wrong, there was that 5% chance that I would be getting the wrong or selecting the wrong hypothesis at the end. All right, so my alternative hypothesis is that there was a relationship between these two variables, and in that case, my p-value would be less than alpha. A couple of the tests that I did, of course, was to go through and look at the Pearson correlation. That was one of the first tests. When I did that, my R value was negative 0.0 0.009. That is so close in the middle. It's so far away from -1 that that's telling me right away there's no correlation. The next test I did was look at the p-value, and with the p-value, I received the 0.881, much greater than alpha. So again, that's the second test, and looking at going, okay, there's no, based on my R value and my Pearson correlation and based on my p-value, there's no correlation between this particular sample of pre-test and post-test scores. The third thing that I looked at was the scatter plot. And this is clearly showing that there's no relationship. There's no really good line of best fit. So with no correlation at all based on those three tests, I realized, okay, there's no correlation, there's no relationship. I accepted my null hypothesis that there was no relationship between the two variables, and therefore, from that, there was no reason to kind of go through and try and create a simple regression. If I had there was no statistical merit to use that formula because there's no correlation. Another one of the findings, again, is by going through and looking, again, a little bit more at that frequency distribution, I found out that 53% of our students were proficient. 53% were proficient with 1/3 or more of the content on the pretest assessment. So with that, one of the biggest implications I thought about was, if teachers really use the pretest, they could really extend a student's knowledge of those standards as that semester went along. So I thought that would probably something, those two things are important to go through and share with other people in my office. Kind of wrapping up this presentation, there are a couple of questions I think that are important for maybe further study. One was, the pretest scores didn't really rise like I really thought they were going to happen. 18 weeks of instruction and our mean score only went up 5 points. So I kept thinking, what kind of conditions need to be put into place to kind of raise that level of post-test scores? And then I thought, oh wow, May, God, that's such a hard time to give a test. It's important to look at what the students' attitudes were towards that assessment. Maybe they were just not giving it their best. It ended up being 20% of their test. I hope 20% of their grade. I hope they gave it a lot of credence and stock in their head, but maybe they didn't. Finally, I was thinking about, is there a different kind of change in instruction that could happen between the pre-test and the post-test that might be able to influence those raw scores, and maybe a correlation could happen. So those were my next questions to do, but I think with that, I'm going to have some new learning to find those answers, to figure that part out. So that was my analysis. I really enjoyed this project. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know. Take care and talk to you later.